Welcome. Let's look at the typical ribs. The ribs are elongated, flat and twisted bone, and of course, lightweight is seen to run from the vertebral column behind to the sternum anteriorly. Remember a lecture on the thoracic cage. If you've not checked that up, please kindly go and check that up to align with this lecture. We said that in the thoracic cage, we have the vertebral column at the posterior part and we have the sternum in the anterior part. And the ribs are twisted, elongated bone that is seen to span from the vertebral column behind to the sternum. And this is the ribs highlighted in white, running posteriorly from the vertebral column, seen in the posterior part of the thoracic cage to the sternum, seen in the anterior part of the thoracic cage. If you look at this image below, this is the rib highlighted in black, seen as a twisted and elongated bone that runs from the vertebral column posteriorly and the sternum anteriorly. So this is the vertebral column, specifically the thoracic vertebra, because it is the thoracic vertebral region of the vertebral column that is seen within the thoracic cage, and that is where the ribs span from. So we have the thoracic vertebra posteriorly, then anteriorly we have the sternum, and this is the sternum where we have anterior connection of the ribs. It is good for us to add that even though we have established that the ribs span from the thoracic vertebra posteriorly to the sternum anteriorly, it is not the entire ribs that are connected to the sternum anteriorly. We have majority of the ribs that are connected to the sternum anteriorly, and these are called the true ribs. And we have a number of ribs that are connected to the sternum indirectly, which means that they are connected to the superior costal cartilages. So they do not have a direct connection to the sternum. While we have rib 11 and 12 that do not have a structural connection to the sternum. So we should know that it is not the entire rib that span from the thoracic vertebra posteriorly to the sternum anteriorly. So going further, let's look at the functions of the ribs. The ribs helps to protect thoracic organ. Remember when we talk about the thoracic cage, we said that we have the thoracic cavity that's enclosed by the thoracic cage. And of course, within the thoracic cavity, we have vital organs like the heart, the lungs, the great vessels, and also some other structures. The ribs, which takes like a major structural component of the thoracic cage, can also be established for this protective function. They also help respiratory activities. We've said that during respiration, the thoracic cage undergoes some form of expansion and also contraction, depending on the situation at hand, whether it is inspiration or expiration. So the ribs, because they are connected to the costal cartilages at the anterior end, which are capable of undergoing some form of expansion. So we can also say that the ribs aid this process because they also contribute to expansion of the thoracic cage, which means that they contribute to the process of respiration. They also create sites for muscular attachment, which means that muscles are also seen to be attached to the ribs. And also going further, they help to accommodate vessels. We would see during the course of this lecture that there's a region in the inferior border of the ribs where we have the costal groove. These costal groove are like indentation that helps to accommodate the intercostal vessels. Going further, the structure of the ribs. Before we study the basic structure of ribs, it's good for us to classify the pattern at which the structure of the ribs are being studied. Ribs generally in terms of structure can be divided into typical ribs and also atypical ribs. For typical ribs, it means that the ribs that have the same structural configuration. So they look alike in terms of what they present. And this ranges from the third rib to the ninth rib, while we have the atypical ribs that are distinct in their own way. So these ribs ranges from the first rib, the second rib, the 10th rib, the 11th and the 12th rib. So these ribs do not have the same structural configuration as the typical ribs. They are specifically designed in their own distinct form. So they have special features that they present. So we can say that the upper two ribs and the lower three ribs are atypical ribs, while the third to the ninth ribs are typical ribs. So the upper region and the lower region tend to fall under the atypical ribs. But we'll be limiting our lecture to the typical ribs. So going through the structural configuration of the typical ribs, that's rib 3 to rib 9. For the typical ribs, the different regions of the typical ribs are being divided into the head, and this is the head region. The head region is the region of the ribs that is connected to the vertebral column behind. If you look at this image down here, this is the head of the rib. We said that this is the vertebral column highlighted in blue, and this is the sternum in the anterior region. So the head region is what actually forms a structural connection with the vertebral column behind. Then going further, we have the neck. The immediate constricted region that we see after the head is the neck, and this is the neck. In the lower region, this is the neck. Then we have the tubercle. The tubercle is the region that is seen after the neck, and this is the tubercle. In this lower diagram, this is the tubercle. Then the remaining region of the ribs is termed the shaft or the body, and this is the shaft or the body. In the lower diagram, this is the shaft or the body. The shaft or the body is the largest region of the ribs, so it takes like the bulk of the ribs. So let's take each of these regions one after the other to see their specific configuration. For the head of the ribs, it is the posterior-medial region, and it is the vertebral end, which means that it is the end that is attached to the vertebral column behind, and this is the head region. So the head region is the posterior medial part of the ribs, and it is this part that is referred to as the vertebral end, which means that it is the region that is connected to the vertebral column posteriorly. What is distinct about the head is that it presents two facets. So we have the inferior facet, which is a larger facet, and we have the superior facet, which is a smaller facet. So this is the superior facet, which is smaller, and we have a lower inferior facet, which is larger. Let's use this image for illustration. Let's say that this is the fourth rib. So we have the fourth rib, and of course, the corresponding thoracic vertebra is the fourth thoracic vertebra. Then superior to the fourth thoracic vertebra, definitely we'll be having the third thoracic vertebra. Remember that this is the superior facet, which is smaller, and this is the inferior facet. For this inferior facet, we said that it is connected to the vertebral body of the corresponding thoracic vertebra. This is also the fourth thoracic vertebra. So it articulates with the body of the fourth thoracic vertebra. While the superior facet, which is smaller, connects to the body of the superior thoracic vertebra, which is the third thoracic vertebra that will fall into this position. This is where this interlock is created. A high tensile strength is created in this region due to the interlocking articulation between the corresponding thoracic vertebra and also the superior thoracic vertebra. So there's a tight connection in this region that also helps to stabilize this joint posteriorly, because this single ribs is now having a connection with the corresponding thoracic vertebra and also the superior thoracic vertebra. And that is how it is presented. So we have the superior facet, then we have the inferior facet. Between the superior and the inferior facet, we have the crest. And the crest is just like an elevation that tends to demarcate the superior and inferior facet. So this is what is presented. And in this image, this is the superior facet, this is the inferior facet. And of course, in between the two facets, we have the crest, and this is the crest in between. So going further is the neck. We said that the neck is the immediate constricted region after the head. It is seen between the head and of course the tubercle. So it runs posterolaterally. So this is the neck of the rib, pointed in red. Also the tubercle. The tubercle is a rough protuberance that is seen after the neck. This is the tubercle. In the tubercle, you also have distinct presentation. As we have facet in the head, we also have another facet in the tubercle. And what this facet articulates with is the transverse process of the corresponding thoracic vertebra. Let's also use this image for illustration down here. This is the facet of the tubercle. And remember, we said that this is the thoracic vertebra of the corresponding level of the ribs, and this is the superior thoracic vertebra. In the thoracic vertebra, the general configuration of vertebral bone is that they have spinous process, which is seen along the median plane, and they have transverse process. So this is the transverse process of the corresponding thoracic vertebra. So this transverse process is what forms articulation with the facet of the tubercle. Remember that the body of the corresponding thoracic vertebra and the superior thoracic vertebra is connected to the facets that are created in the head, which are the superior and the inferior facets. While the transverse process connects with the facet of the tubercle, you can see that there's a number of articulations that are created within this region. Is just to further stabilize the joint that is created between the thoracic vertebra and also the ribs. Then talking about the shaft is the longest section of the ribs, and it runs inferiorlaterally. It is twisted before it is not directed anteriorly, where it finally attaches to the sternum through the costal cartilage. We have the head, we have the neck, and we have the tubercle, and the remaining region is the shaft or the body. And this is the shaft or the body. The shaft or the body do finally terminate at this region. So they are not directly connected to the sternum, but they are connected to the sternum through the costal cartilage. There are some important regions within the shaft that is good for us to highlight, and that is the angle. The angle of the rib is a rapid change in angulature that is seen in the ribs. Remember, we said the ribs span from the thoracic vertebra posteriorly to be attached anteriorly to the sternum. There is a region along the shaft where there is this sharp turning. It tends to create a rapid change in the curvature of the ribs, and that region is called the angle of the ribs, and this is the angle of the ribs pointed in yellow. We also have the costal groove. The costal groove are indentation or depression created along the inferior border of the ribs on the internal surface. So if you look at the internal surface of the ribs, if you go down along the inferior border, you see an indentation that is created, a depression, so to say. This depression accommodates the intercostal vessels. So they are not just left open. They are created so that the intercostal vessels can have a path to run through. So these are called the costal groove, and this is the region pointed in red. Also, at the terminal anterior end of the rib, we have the sternal end. So the end through which it connects with the costal cartilage is the sternal end, while the end above, as we already said before, that the end through which it connects with the vertebral column is the vertebral end. So this is the sternal end because it is through this end that it connects with the sternum, but through the costal cartilage. So let's look at the joint of the ribs. Remember, we said that the ribs, they span from the vertebral column posteriorly to the sternum anteriorly, although not the entire ribs. But let's look at the joints that these ribs, they present within the thoracic cage. The first one is the costovertebral joint. What we need to do is to break the name down, costo and vertebra. Costo means ribs, while vertebra means the thoracic vertebra. So it means the joint that is seen between the head of the ribs, and this is where we have the head of the ribs, and also the body of the thoracic vertebra. So this joint is seen around this region posteriorly. Also around the posterior part of the thoracic cage, we have the costotransverse joint. These, we still need to break the name down, costo and transverse. Costo, we already said, means rib. Transverse means the transverse process of the thoracic vertebra. So this is the joint that is seen between the rib tubercle and also the transverse process of corresponding thoracic vertebra. And this is where this joint is, still at the posterior part of the thoracic cage. So this is where we have the costovertebral joint and also the costotransverse joint. Between specific regions of the thoracic vertebra and also the head and tubercle of the ribs. So this is the costovertebral joint that is seen between the head of the ribs and also the body of the thoracic vertebra. And this is the costotransverse joint that is seen between the rib tubercle and also the transverse process of the corresponding thoracic vertebra. In the anterior part of the thoracic cage, you have the costochondrial joint. What we still need to do is to break the name down for us to know where this joint is formed. And costo, we already said, means ribs. Chondrial means the costal cartilage. So it is the joint that is seen anteriorly between the sternal end of the rib. This is the sternal end in the anterior region of the rib, and also the costal cartilage. You already said that the rib does not have a direct connection with the sternum. It is connected through the costal cartilage. But before it does this, of course, it will need to be connected to the costal cartilage. So the joint that is seen between the sternal end of the ribs, which is seen in the anterior part, and also the costal cartilage, is the costochondrial joint. So this is where you have the costochondrial joint in the anterior part. And this is the costochondrial joint. So in summary, we have two joints at the posterior part of the thoracic cage, and we have one joint in the anterior part of the thoracic cage. And these are the three joints formed by the ribs within the thoracic cage. But it is good for us to have the sternocostal joint. The sternocostal joint, although it is not formed by the ribs, but it has an indirect connection with the ribs, because it is through this joint that the ribs finally connects to the sternum, because we said that this rib does not have direct connection with the sternum anteriorly, but it is connected through the costal cartilage. So after its connection to the costal cartilage will finally need to be connected to the sternum so as to give that structural stability to the ribs. the sternocostal joint, what we still need to do is to break the name down. So the sternocostal joint is the joint that is seen between the sternum anteriorly and also the costal cartilage. So it is through this joint that the rib finally, although is indirectly connected to the sternum. So it's good for us to also highlight this joint. So let's check out this question. These are multiple choice questions that we can try on our own. So the first one is the rib tubercle attached to the A, the spinous process of the thoracic vertebra, B, the transverse process of the thoracic vertebra, C, the body of the thoracic vertebra. This should come easy. The second question is the costal groove. A, accommodates the intercostal vessel. B, is seen along the superior border of the ribs. C, is an empty space. Then the third question is the inferior facet that is seen in the head of the ribs articulate with what? Is it the inferior thoracic vertebra? Is it the corresponding thoracic vertebra, or is it the superior thoracic vertebra? You can send your response to the comment section where it will be graded. So thanks for watching. Let's meet again.